Piscine wyverns are some of the most intriguing monsters in the series, exhibiting overtly fish or shark-like characteristics whilst having partially or fully terrestrial lifestyles. In waterways and surprisingly arid regions too, they can also be important top-order carnivores. Cephadrome and Jyuratodus are two such examples, one dependent on mud and the other on sand, but both aggressive hunters of their respective ecosystems. So let's explore. Perhaps one of the most eye-catching features Cephadrome can do is to swim through sand as if it were water. This is an ability it shares with a real-life lizard, the sandfish skink. It was believed for some time that the skinks possessed unique scales for this ability, to allow them to slip easily through granular substrates, but research shows that their scales aren't really that exceptional in the fields of reducing friction. Dry lubricants and some species of snake exceed them in this regard. Rather, it's believed that it's the locomotion, the elasticity of the skin and the tissues beneath, that likely allows such seamless movements through a mass of solids. So from a scale point of view at very least, there isn't anything yet to suggest that Cephadrome wouldn't be able to achieve the same. In fact, it could be that Cephadrome and its underlings have the superior attributes it was believed sandfish once had, to compensate for their far greater sizes. But if it's not unique scales, how exactly are sandfish swimming through sand then? Well, it's more its own specialised form of movement, much more like a mammal swimming than another lizard. It undulates its body like a swimming reptile, but whilst pulling itself through the sand with its limbs. One factor here is that this can only be done in certain types of loose sand, or substrate, and another is that the sand has to be moved through at a certain speed to cause the vertical oscillation of the sand to get it to behave like a liquid, instead of a solid. It's suggested that this is why the sandfish undulates its body as it swims, to locally decompact the sand to get it to behave like a liquid, and on top of this the sandfish moves at a great enough speed to do this anyway. For Cephadrome, maybe this is the reason for the hammerhead. Its unique shape may perform the same function as the sandfish's undulations of decompacting the sand, so the wyvern can push its body through it. It could also be that it moves at the correct speed to do this as well, and cephalots seem to swim with thunniform movement, mainly driving with the tail. This allows for great speed and energy-efficient movement, both of which may be very important for sand swimming. The wing fins may be primarily for steering, and it may keep the legs pinned to the body for most swimming until they need to leap free from the sand, when they may be used to provide additional thrust. Another physical similarity between the two may be how the skin reacts to water. In sandfish, the skin between the scales collects water likely as an adaptation to living in such arid environments. Cephalos scales are interestingly said to do something similar. Despite their dusty appearance, cephalots naturally have vivid sky blue or purple scales with pink fins, and we can see this in the armour once the materials have been properly cleaned and processed. Only the mature males that become cephadromes have black scales and fins. It's mentioned that cephalos scales only take on their true coloration as they take on water, so it can be assumed that this is a similar mechanism to collect dew and water in the air, in the areas with very little rainfall. Outside of very rare freak desert storms, the vast majority of even the most experienced hunters and researchers may never see a cephalos's true colours. Other piscines may have further uses for the scales too, and interestingly, Jyuratodus is described as being able to breathe through them so long as they're wet. When drying out, they become brittle, making them less functional for both armour and respiration. This is very similar to what we see in amphibians, who breathe through their skin so long as it's relatively damp. It's unknown if this is unique to Jyuratodus among piscines due to the mud, or if it's a universal family trait. A lot of fish when in neonate stages will breathe through their skin prior to gill formation, so maybe this is a vestigial trait kept in Jyuratodus due to the low oxygen waters it swims in. Or maybe piscines are just generally weirder than first thought. Another interesting thing mentioned about Jyuratodus is that it has a dental plate, what seems to be a section of flat bone in the jaw to absorb stress and strengthen the bite that indeed allows it to crush bone. This ostensibly allows for the predation of large prey, and especially armoured prey like Apsaros. But with the feeding habits of juveniles, it's unknown when this develops and how it evolved, and why, when other piscines don't seem to have this specified. Large sharks already have pretty powerful bites. Great white sharks are estimated to have immensely powerful ones, among the strongest of any extant animal. That said, it's unknown if the shark's cartilage jaws could quite take the very highest estimate, and they do so with deformation to the jaws, albeit without much reduction in bite force. Great whites feed pretty violently, but not on very tough animals, typically blubbery seals often smaller than them, or the energy-rich blubber of whale carcasses, so their powerful jaws are more adapted to violent use over tough prey. Horn sharks also have some pretty intense bite forces that allow them to crush up marine invertebrates, and this may be somewhat more analogous as to how such jaws developed in Jyuratodus. Adapting to very tough prey results in lowered prey diversity and niche specialization, and Jyuratodus doesn't seem to be hyper-specialized in this regard, with it being described as taking just about anything and even actually preferring organ meat. It seems possible that Jyuratodus' ancestor was a smaller animal, that may have been like a freshwater horn shark that was something of a mollusk specialist. Large and/or desperate individuals may have begun to exploit young Apsaros as prey, being able to do so as durophages, and had a guaranteed source of food with their dependence on coming to drinking water. This led to speciation over time in the more generalist Jyuratodus that kept some adaptations for durophagy for tough prey. The preference for organs apparently comes from the juvenile stage of Jyuratodus, when they live as parasites in other aquatic life, entering via any opening and then feeding on their host until death. Jyuratodus are said to reproduce like fish, their females spawning huge masses of eggs, and then the males fertilizing them. So with this method of reproduction, it can be assumed hatchlings are likely relatively small indeed. The book also mentions they can be predated by just normal fish. Their small size likely allows them a broad range of hosts though, and this is very similar to a certain genus of catfish that lives a similar lifestyle. The Vandaline includes the famous candiru, well known for the fortunately very likely false tales of it swimming up the urethra of urinating people. But it does feed on the blood of larger fish and stingrays, typically inserting itself in the gills and feeding off an artery, being equipped with barbs to prevent it being dislodged. These catfish only take as much as they need though, and also use fish for transport too, whereas it's said Jyuratodus eat their hosts in their entirety. It's unknown if they select a large host while small and then grow to the point of being fatal and eat the corpse, or if they select hosts within a certain range of their own body. But from the size of other aquatic animals, it does seem Jyuratodus can only get so large before they run out of potential hosts. Once larger than a gajor, it seems the only thing they'd be able to parasitize is other Jyuratodus. It is mentioned that they're cannibals, and that young Jyuratodus will readily eat each other. So as well as larger young eating smaller ones, it could be possible that smaller young may parasitize their larger cousins. Another possible explanation is that Jyuratodus have a secondary life stage between parasite and macro-predator, of eating smaller things in the murk with them like shellfish and turtles. The bite force of juvenile bull sharks scales with positive allometry, which is to say as the baby shark grows, its bite force is much greater than what you'd expect for its body size at that age. It's suggested this is to help them exploit more resources at early ages, giving them a competitive leg up. Perhaps it's the same with Jyuratodus, and they have a stage of being active predators once they've grown too large for gajor, but are too small for Apsaros. They hunt in the murk for other aquatic life, and are capable of taking even the toughest prey until they graduate into the crocodile-like ambush predators of large herbivores that adults are. It's possible Jyuratodus may inhabit more typical wetlands outside of the arid wildspire mudflats, and have a wider distribution than first thought. This may mean in other parts of its range, its diet shares much more prey that shares the murky waterways like slagtoth, other piscines, amphibians and young leviathans. It's suggested with bull sharks which regularly hunt in murky water, A strong bite force is necessary to both hold and incapacitate prey due to how hard it may be to find again. With this, it may also be that the dental plate in its strong bite force occurs from birth in Jyuratodus as it allows them to best latch onto hosts. Maybe the dental plate and jaw morphology aren't a specialised tool after all, but more of a Swiss Army knife playing a role in each stage of its lifestyle, serving it as a clamp when a parasite and a nutcracker when as a predator. Durophagy may not be unique to Jyuratodus in the Piscine wyverns though. One of the cephalos calves is a hardfang, a specialised type of tooth specified to be strong enough to gnaw through carapacian armour. Despite the visible row of shark-like teeth visible in cephalos, it's possible they may actually have heterodont teeth, and possess a back row of more robust hardfangs analogous to molars to deal with tougher prey. It may be, wherever possible, cephalos prefer soft vertebrates. They show predatory interest in the hunter, and the first quest for Cephadrome is due to them eating the pack animals of the desert caravans. But deserts aren't exactly stuffed with large vertebrate life, and the hermitors may be a reliable dietary fallback in lean times in an already lean environment. It's mentioned that despite being giant crabs, daimyo hermitors aren't necessarily keen on water, but rather sand. From the numbers of small hermitors, it can be assumed that they're relatively prolific breeders like smaller crabs, and so hermitors of smaller age classes may be the most reliable source of prey for cephalos in the sandy deserts of the Old World. They are described as lying in wait for their own prey in the sand, but the sensitive prey detection mechanisms of the cephalos may be more effective, and allow them to find even stationary hermitors to predate. Durophagy has evolved multiple times in real sharks, and so it's not unreasonable to suggest that the two desert piscines either evolved it independently to a similar challenge of accessing tough desert prey, or maybe the muddy taxonomy of piscine wyverns gets muddier, with Jyuratodus and Cephadrome sharing a relatively recent common ancestor. Cephalos and their large leader likely hunt in a similar way to sandfish, relying on vibrations in the sand. In the lizards, this is a successful tactic for both above and below ground targets, and they also seem to have some idea of applying different measures to different prey. With slow mealworms, sandfish tend to take a more leisurely approach and burrow towards them. With fast crickets, they tend to submerge and run them down. Thus, it does seem that sandfish are capable of recognising their prey, or at least their prey's speed, by its step rate on the surface and can track its movements. When hunting on the surface, the lizards also show a stereotyped behaviour of burying their head for several seconds to listen to prey, almost like a reverse spy hopping seen in sharks. Cephadrome likely cuts out much of the need for any above ground movement by having eyes placed on top of the skull, so it can see without having to emerge more than just a few inches. Their ungainly movement on land and great speed in the sand also likely means they're even more specialised sand hunters than sandfish, preferring to do most of their attacks from below ground. It's believed the sandfish have fine hearing to do this, and this is something the cephalos share with them. Considering the distance from prey they can detect it at, this nicely explains the great vulnerability to loud noises the piscines have. A sonic bomb almost certainly causes very intense inner ear pain. Despite sandfish being selective with how they hunt, cephalos may not be, or they may not be especially bright. It could be they operate on a bite first, ask questions later attitude that results in them making such questionable decisions as taking on bloss wyverns, that can sometimes have fatal results for them. As said in their video, we know very little of the early life of bloss wyverns, but either way it's very likely Cephadrome and their packs are very substantial threats, and with their ability to hunt through sand making them the only predator that can pursue baby bloss into their hideaways. This has likely resulted in instinctive hostility on sight from adult bloss wyverns, and especially broody females like black diablos. Jyuratodus is similarly ambitious with potential prey, and on occasion will attack Baroth. As well as Baroth bulldozing through the territorial markers they leave, this can be as simple as attempted predation. With powerful jaws, a Jyuratodus can work its way through Baroth armour, and upon finding a dead Baroth, they're not opposed to eating them. A healthy adult is typically too resilient for a Jyuratodus to take down, but infirm specimens may make these occasional attempts on any Baroth they come across worthwhile. Baroth may also be somewhat hostile to Jyuratodus in return, due to them being the chief predator in the New World able to access their mud nests and vulnerable young. Adults, especially brooding ones, may be habitually aggressive to any Piscine coming too close. To possibly trip swift prey or to try and ward off potential attacks, Cephalos will also spit sand. This process is also, again, probably quite similar to the sandfish, and also answers the question of how do you breathe when you're submerged in a solid. And it's really as simple as the sandfish gets around this by expelling the inhaled sand caught in the nasal passages by coughing or sneezing, or in some cases ingesting it too. So Cephalos may have a similar mechanism where caught sand is stored in a unique form of sac or organ, and then spat at things that trigger a hostile response. And this may be ubiquitous across the Piscines. Jyuratodus will spit mud, but this isn't just mud consumed from its environment. It's described as mixing it with a mucus to make it more viscous. Piscine wyverns may take on small amounts of whatever substrate they swim in, and then mix it with internal bodily fluids to give it additional physical properties. Plesioth's water spray, Lavasioth's lava, and Jyuratodus's ice may all have some extra factor to make it more dangerous or repellent to attackers. A final point regarding Cephadrome is whether it's actually a social animal or not. And as far as dromes and greats go, I think it's probably the outlier in that it has little real relationship to its underlings. It's described as the leader of the Cephalos pack, but at no point in its fight or any related media does it really engage with them in any way. It's telling that unlike the other dromes, greats or monkeys, it has no call or signal to attract subordinates. And if anything in its For You intro, Cephalos seem more cautious of it than anything and seem to give way to it when hunting. Considering Cephalos are already large-bodied animals, it doesn't seem likely Cephadrome performs much or any role as a keystone individual for its subordinates. Sharks in some instances do seem to show preferential associations with each other, but the reasons behind it are still somewhat unknown. It's suggested it may be reducing risk of attack from larger sharks, and indeed their own species when they're young as well, on top of increasing foraging efficiency. This typically occurs in similarly sized individuals, so it seems compared to the raptors or monkeys, the association between Cephalos and Cephadrome is probably quite a weak one, and maybe even really just for breeding. Outside of the mating seasons, Cephadrome may live more solitary lives, and potentially even eat Cephalos. So to sum up my thoughts on the two, I think Cephadrome may be my candidate for the worst fight in the series. Literally just a giant damage sponge Cephalos that spends half the fight avoiding you. If nothing else, even in janky old punishing first gen, it went down a lot easier than expected for something so big. But that's about the nicest thing you can say for it gameplay wise. Design wise though, I actually do quite like it. I really like the Diplocaulus style head and like Plesioth, the great marriage of fish and wyvern traits. Despite everything, I really do think it's quite iconic. The sand swimming gimmick, whilst implemented absolutely awfully, did actually look quite cool the first time you saw it. I still remember being 10 and going to the first gen desert map on the PS2 for the very first time to see the sand sharks leaping around in Area 1, and finding it just such a cool concept. It's a shame that goodwill didn't really last when I had to hunt them. Jyuratodus on the other hand I don't quite get the hate for in World. Yes, it's not exactly Iceborne Fatalis, but on the other hand it was only ever meant to be a mid-tier fight to introduce you to a few new concepts, and I think it does its job in that regard just fine. I never understood why people apparently seem to have such great expectations for it. Design-wise, I actually think it's reasonably solid too, and like many early Game World originals, it does a very good job of selling itself as a living animal. In Rise, I think a lot of people actually quite enjoyed it, and it does seem at long last Capcom have the fun Piscine fight nailed down, actually have it pay attention to the player and attack, have it spend more time out of its substrate, give it more than 3 moves, and allow it to hit and be hit whilst in the substrate it lives in. All in all, not too difficult. I hope they can apply it to Cephadrome in the future, as I think it's a shame for such an iconic design to be wasted. Some may think that Jyura just usurps Cephadrome's role, but not necessarily. I was also convinced that Frontier did something right. Watching the hardcore Cephadrome fight, it actually looks okay. It fully using its role as a social monster, using its subordinates in a feeding frenzy against the player is a nice touch, and a good one to differentiate it from other Piscines. Give it some new moves, and who knows, could it be an alright fight? Thanks for watching. Depending on when I get this out, Happy New Year, or have a Happy New Year. It's either my first or last video of the year, so wahoo either way. I did mean to get it out around Christmas, but Primal absorbed so much of its time with the constant re-editing and re-uploading, and then I was pretty busy over the festive period with all that real life stuff, so here we are. Like a great many people, the continuing ripple effect of COVID and the rise of Omicron mean I can only answer what are your plans for 2022 with good question. Rest assured I am going to keep making videos, but they may come at a slower pace. Or not, who knows. But some good news is that the Iceborne book was announced for early 2022, so when it comes out, by all means, let's go. Thanks for all the positivity regarding Primal too. I was cautious making it as I wondered if it was just too much recap and not enough breakdown, but it seems that most of you enjoyed it, so more of those in the far future. As a brief point, a few of you mentioned too, with Spear's flashback in A Cold Death, in the animatics for the episode, Tartakovsky does indeed mention the child as Spear's son, rather than Spear when he was a kid, but then in the early episodes their character design changes quite a bit. These animatics are all on YouTube, and well worth watching, not only for Tartakovsky's personal sound effects but also for deleted scenes, like the Lost World-esque raptor stalk that was cut from Blood Moon. Whilst I do plan to stick with Monster Hunter for a while, I appreciate all the ideas for both in-between Monster Hunter videos and ones to do once the bulk of the roster is done, until the next main series game comes out at least too, and I hope at least some of you will show up for them, and here's the teaser for the next monster.